Oh, Taipei from Illinois for a 3-day conference. It's going to be a really
Right.
short 3 days. It's going to be a long flight.
It just seemed insane to me in terms of like the flight time to being on the
I
ground
know.
ratio. But I don't know
Just to be
why
there
she
for
did
three
it.
days. I don't know. Yeah.
I would do it for Beyonce.
Anybody watching soccer? World Cup? Anybody? Yeah, I'm very much into it. So very exciting games and yeah. All right, we're about 2 minutes past our time, so I'm going to hit the recording button and get us started because we have a lot to accomplish
Recording in
as
progress.
always. Okay. So if you turned in your paper, I do have them in front of me, and I'm in the process of reading them. So my promise is to get them back to you by next class time, okay, with my feedback and the points you earned. Um, so looking forward to that, to reading everything and then giving you some feedback on your first paper. And, of course, if you don't have my feedback by then, just let me know. Or if you have any questions about my feedback, also let me know too. But, but my promise is to get them back to you by next class time. All right. So having said that, I want to talk about the next paper and the final paper, second and the final paper, right? This is called the positionality paper. This is talking about you, okay, now. Okay. This is due Sunday after a week 11 class. So, excuse me. So it is due a little over 2 weeks from today, right? Sunday after our week 11 class, and we're on week 9 this week. So, you still have, a little longer than 2 weeks to prepare for this paper. And let me go over what I'm looking for. Let me just make sure that if there's anyone else trying to come in. No? Okay. Okay. So you're going to talk about yourself now that you are we're almost done talking about like various different student development theories. Now use the theories to reflect upon how you developed as a student, and also use the lens to like look at yourself and reflect on your own like development. Okay. So positionality is the influence of your social identities such as gender, religion, disability, race, age, sexual orientation, so on and so forth, right? As well as other characteristics such as values, ethics, and training on your worldview, your research, and leadership practices. So, in a nutshell, I want you to look into both the micro and macro aspects and influences that have shaped who you are. Okay, not just as a student, but as a person. Okay, overall. Right. So positionality is a self-reflective space in which you examine who you are and the ways in which these identities inform your outlook, leadership, research, and practice. So you're all doctoral level student, which means that you have to think about your own research too. So how does that shape, your own research and the motivation for doing research and motivation for doing the research in the area that you're interested in? Because I know that many of you have talked to me about your interests, and my guess is that you're interested in that particular research because, either you are really deeply, interested in it because of your own experience, your professional experience, or your future goals, or your family. So that all has to do with positionality. Okay. So the purpose of this paper is threefold: to continue your development as a reflective scholar practitioner, and to gain additional practice reflecting on an idea from a literature in this course, and to provide an opportunity for you to begin crafting your own articulation of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this is going to be a little shorter paper compared to the one that you just completed. 6 to 8 pages double spaced, APA 7th formatting. Okay, okay, the APA 7th formatting is important for you to practice, as that's the type of style that we're using in our field. And thank you, Samreen, for sharing that link. The rubric: identify 3 or more specific social identities that are most salient to you. 3 or more. Okay, I know that we have more than 3, so you're more than welcome to talk about more than 3, but at least I would love for you to talk about 3 plus, or 3 at least, specific social identities that are most salient to you. So it could be race, ethnic identities, gender identities, disability, ability identities, and we talked about many different identities, and as well as developments in this course that you can apply to this paper. So social identities are the socially constructed groups with which you identify. Please focus primarily on social identities and not solely on personality traits. Okay. So now I am funny. This is like personality traits or a social relationship. I'm a father of 3, right? So socially constructed, meaning that, for example, we talked much about like racial identities last week, about how, ethnic minority sometimes is constructed, by ourselves. And sometimes it's constructed by the society, okay? And they define who we are. This is like social construction. And I also gave you like some, instructions on, how micro and macro, like different layers of social influences will shape who you are in positionality, and like a micro aspect. And so that's something that we also want to talk about. One, like a layers, right? And then you are thinking about who you are, and how does that shape the people around you, and also how the people around you shaped who you are, okay? Vice versa. Describe the specific ways in which those identities have informed your personal, professional, and scholarly worldview. Discuss actual or potential biases or limitations or shaped by your identities. This is very important. So we, don't often talk about the limitations that we might hold as a result of our limited experiences and lenses that we bring in. So this would be a critical lens that you'll be using to make sure that you are also thinking about some limitations based on our own limited experiences or lenses, or identities. As a starting point to develop your approach to this paper, you may want to begin by reflecting on how your identities inform your views of others. How do your identities inform the people with whom you connect with or feel a sense of affinity? Okay. So, like I said, this is about you, but this is about people that you interact with. Okay. So how your positionality really shape how you, interact with other people around you, and vice versa? How do the other people around you shape who you are? Drawing on class discussions and readings, please briefly articulate your own notion of diversity, equity, and inclusion in relation to your own self-reflection as a leader in higher education. So how does your own understanding and self-reflection impact others that you supervise? students that you teach, programs that you develop, and other aspects of your professional identity. So this is about like, using the readings and class discussions as evidence to talk about your positionality as well as your scholarly and professional experiences and your goals. Okay. So pretty straightforward, I think, right? And it does not say how many readings that you need to use from the course, but I know I always get that question from students, what is the ballpark figure as to what you're expecting? I would say about 4 plus, okay, readings from the course. But I'm not gonna, deduct points if you just give me 3. But it's gonna be like a ballpark figure, like 3 to 5, right? Plus. But I really care about how you use the readings, right? And I said the importance of using evidence to validate your arguments last time when I was talking about writing a scholarly paper, right? So the one piece of evidence, of course, is your readings or literature. Okay, as a researcher, we're always trying to like validate our points. And how do you use literature to the point where you can really maximize the strength of your argument, okay? You want to talk about what the readings say briefly, okay? And you don't just say whatever you are arguing and you just use citations, okay? And you might want to briefly talk about how this relates to what you're citing. And then you want to like make very concrete connections between your arguments or your points and also what the readings are saying specifically. Okay, so we all know as readers how you're making connections between what you're saying and the readings. Okay, so that's what I'm looking for. If you do a good job on it, you can get a good grade with just 3 citations from the course. If you give me like 10 citations, very solid citations from the course, but if you don't, give me a solid connections between your arguments and the readings, I might say build your points more using the evidence that you are bringing into your paper. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay. All right, and you're going to get more specific feedback from me on your first paper. So hopefully you get a better idea because we all have strengths and also areas of improvements when it comes to writing. So I'll be happy to provide you with additional support. At this point in your study, I mean, especially when you're in doctoral programs, I don't really care about grades. You're all, entitled to get A pluses, right? For being here and spending time doing your doctoral work. But, I really do care about, helping you improve. Okay. I think that's really important. So you might get A pluses, but I'll be giving you feedback regardless, okay, of you getting 100%, right? So just look for my feedback and don't just think, oh, I got good grade, so therefore I can just move on. But try to read my feedback thoroughly to see if there's anything you can do to improve even further. Okay. All right, good. Any questions? All right, no questions so far, so good. I am then going to ask, before I ask the discussion leaders, can I ask you to share some of the highlights from your papers? Okay, so I'm gonna give you put you into breakout and then spend some time just sharing your highlights from your paper because I know that you've all investigated the findings and talked about the strengths and weaknesses of the research paper. So I would love for you to share a little bit from the paper And then together as a group, you want to like talk about something that you want to share with the larger group. Okay. So I'll give you about like 15, 20 minutes to do so before we get, dive into today's discussion. Sounds good? Okay. So if you have some visuals to share, you're more than welcome to use them. If not, then you can share the paper itself or briefly like chat with the groups and so that we can all understand what you found from your research. Okay. And then we'll talk about it as a whole group. Now let me.
Hello. Hello.
Hello.
How's
How's
everyone's
everyone's
going?
doing?
So.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well done.
okay.
This,
This,
I
I
don't
don't
know
know
if
if
you
you
all
all
were
were
having,
having,
or
or
if you
if you
had
had
to
to
do
do.
financially at all, but my tuition just got paid yesterday for the summer.
Oh,
So I just got to register for classes today. So it's been a roller coaster, but we're great.
The financial aid issue, man, that should have been a paper. We should have all had the opportunity to write about that because,
I
yeah,
know.
this summer was a little hectic.
It
It
was
was
tough.
tough.
Um, but okay, I'm trying to drop in my visual.
Yes,
Yes,
I've
I've
got my
got
visual
visual
too.
too.
Okay, chat and drop. So I did my paper on um, neurodivergence and leadership, and how sometimes it's important to reconceptualize neurodiversity when living in a atypical world, right? Or I guess a non-atypical world, and to focus more on the capability versus the deficit. And so, what the article that I chose, I specifically looked at research for students, or I guess people with autism spectrum disorder, and how they have specific core components of strengths, but what really holds them back is the social aspect. In a world where you can easily climb a ladder or you could easily be given a job because you're socially outgoing rather than someone who might have social anxiety. And so they might be amazing at their job, but if they're not able to incorporate the social component, they're not going to go very far. And so their ability to move up or just get well-rounded holistic work experience is going to be stunted because their lack of fitting into a society that wasn't necessarily made for them. And so the three strengths that really this author my research looked at was systemizing visual and spatial thinking and the need for rules and routine, and how that allows uh, the workplace to flow better with information searches, novel thinking, and stewardship. It really helps to operationalize a lot of the things that I'm assuming a lot of us have felt need more, not necessarily need to be more operationalized in the sense that we need to make a flow, like a yes no flow chart specifically, but sometimes when we don't allow for a diverse pool of employees, we sometimes miss the mark when helping the students that we serve. And so it was a twofold for me. I really enjoyed the research that was done, because it ultimately came back to helping the students who are in front of us. That's the whole reason why we are all here as educators, right? Is we're here to serve students. So one, we are modeling for them when they see people who look like them, who think like them, who act like them, so on and so forth. But also, it helps them to navigate through college and then into the workforce, knowing that there are places that they can go and be themselves, and not necessarily be looked at from a deficit mindset. So that's pretty much what my paper was about. It was just reconceptualizing what leadership should look like and can look like when introducing a neurodiverse perspective.
Thank you. Um, I'm happy to go next if that's okay. Put my info or put my graphic in the chat. So I titled my paper, so the role of self-authorship in fostering belonging leadership among first generation college students. And the article that I chose was Marcia Baxter Magolda, and she was talking about the three elements of self-authorship. Those main elements that she touched on, were trusting your internal voice, building on internal foundation, and securing internal commitments. One of the main points that really stood out to me from this one is the research, the heavy research she did within this paper. So she did a 21-year longitudinal study just of young adults, ranging from 18 to 39 years old. And she really honed in and focused on again, the trusting your internal voice, building your internal foundation, and securing internal commitments. And so she looked at this narrative of a participant, her name was Dawn, and how she really encompassed and illustrated these three pillars, more so of trying to actualize her self-authorship. And so she was able to interconnect what this looks like ultimately, that argues that for higher education, more so for like fostering belonging and looking at our leadership, that we need to be able to have the capacity to prepare students for complex demands of adult life and global citizenship. Dawn, more so her story, which was very interesting for me, and on a like it was just a whim that I chose this article, but it resonated so hard with me because she went through her college years, but she really did a timeline that was not of her own, and one that was written by, community, environment, family, if you will, and not anything that she did. And so she took time to really, travel and try and find herself. But during that time, she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis that really changed the trajectory of her life. And through that, that's when she was able to really define and figure out her internal voice and how she wanted the rest of her life to flow. And so, with that, with that being said, I was thinking about, I brought in a little bit my internal journey of, finding, my voice, but also looking at higher education from the lens of a first generation college student, and how it was really, really difficult to navigate that system early on, without having a sense of that belonging. And even if I should be in the college setting, more so, I think that what really drew me to this was the fact that I really shaped my college experience around relying on academic advisors to hopefully hone in and give me what I needed from them. And because that didn't happen, that just changed the trajectory of my life and school and going back at a later time. And so, within my paper, I chose to then reflect on what are the bigger things in which leadership and can do to help not only foster that belonging for first gen students, but also give them the tools to write their own story and make sure that, we have an institutional system that doesn't necessarily place the expectations on you, but helps you with those questions and helps empower you to develop your own identity and your leadership, in your capacities within higher education. And again, to foster that self-authorship. And so, in essence, that was what my paper was. And I actually really enjoyed writing it. So thank you.
Thanks, Ernest and Aaron. So mine might sound a little familiar, especially for Ernest, because we kind of use this for our research in our presentation. So mine was on the veteran critical theory. I used a different article, and this one was more about advocacy for veterans in higher education. So it's very similar, but actually the research went more into in depth with the third space for veterans, and also about like basically the hidden institutional failures where like they place the veteran offices and services. So most of them are found in like the basements of the institutions. And then they're also hidden under the umbrella of disability services, which it's crazy because when we hear Anthony sometimes of how, the challenges he has about reaching the USC veteran office. USC, because I work for the VA, actually has one of the most robust veteran resource services and offices. So it's always interesting to hear those challenges, and then also connecting it back into the article that I read. So it kind of went into more of the 11 tenant toolboxes with this article and the research, and the author or the researcher pretty much was just talking about how even as professors or civilians, they tend to speak on the experience, but they don't have the actual experience of the veterans. And so that takes away from what actually is the needs of what veterans do need. And so I always relate this back because as a veteran and then also someone that continuously works and advocates on their behalf for their vocational and higher ed, I always think it's very important that we're not speaking on behalf of somebody's experience, and also just making the time to listen. So then that way we can make those changes and create policies that are going to be more fitting for what is necessary for them to move forward and to be successful in the career field that they're pursuing.
Thank you, Liz, for sharing that. So I picked the article called Disability and Undefined Development Model. I chose this article because from my own experience as a person with a disability, this article talks about how they interview 17 students with disability, different kinds of disabilities, and how it affects how they accept their own disability, and also how like the process in the community and also their classes as well. So, in this article, it talks about acceptance. Like, the interview, it talks about like how students were able to accept the disability and how other students were not able to accept it. And it took them a while to like understand their own disability and also navigating it because again of like barriers and also discrimination where students talks about their own life experience of facing um the the shame of having a disability. So that's where the author talks about accepting how to not let your disability define you who you are as a person, but just being yourself. And relationships talks about too. Second is like building relationship in the community and the disability field, like learning about people's disability. Because again, everyone's disability is different. Not everyone's the same. Everyone has their own experience and their own navigation. And then adaptation. So where people's navigating their own disability and also how to navigate that in their classes and as well as like a living life and having people to understand them too. And last is engagement is how to advocate themselves because in this study it talks about how students are having a hard time advocating and learn how to what to do and not to do. And I really like this article a lot because it kind of reminds me when I was an undergrad, like how it really taught me to like advocate for myself in a way where I never did before. I was always ashamed having a disability until was in college where there was an incident with a professor who discriminated me right in front of like 30 people in the class because I just could not read a book out loud due to my disability, even though I told this professor before class about my accommodation and disclosed my disability. And I got made fun of. And since then, I learned to advocate by myself, but to not be ashamed of it. So like this article like has like a really like meaningful for me as well.
That was wonderful. Danielle, I think you did a good job. I liked everyone's graphics. Do you think that Dr. Min was intentional when she placed us all? Because all of us intersect in some way with disability
Oh
in our
no, to be
papers.
honest. But I really like your guys' everything like article and related to disability because I feel like in higher ed, I feel like disability is not really talked about if I'm being honest. So just hearing your guys' point of view and talking about mental health too, it helps a lot because I feel like and my own experience in my master's, when I did my master's, disability was always like not talked about, it was always skipped. Even like they didn't want to talk about it or like even mention about it. Where sometimes there's some people does not knowledge about people with disabilities. So and that's the sad part is like as being now doing my doctorate, it's really important to understand people with disabilities, not to make assumptions, but rather to understand.
Um, I really love the notion that she did put us all in the same group for that purpose. I think for me, because it wasn't spoken about so much, I never gave it a second thought. And then um when I started the program in fall of 25, I started realizing um very late in life, which was hard, and I'm still trying to navigate my neurodivergence and what that looks like. So, Daniela, when you bring up the fact about like not being able to like read a book aloud and stuff, I remember sitting like little thinking about it too when I'm younger too in church, and you've got your scriptures out and you're going around in a circle and you have to read. I literally would count to be like, oh my gosh, okay, which chapter am I going to get? And then if I couldn't read something, I'd get up and go to the bathroom and leave because like I could not read some of those words and it was really difficult. And when I asked my mom about in elementary and school, like, was there any indication of anything of like learning disability in any shape or form? And she's like, your teachers would say things, but I think it was just back then there wasn't much to go off of. So we just, let you try and learn the way you needed to learn, which was in resource. And, that only went so far. So I appreciate you talking about this because it resonates, but I appreciate when we bring light to things that are so taboo for people. That's why I talk to my students about therapy and healthy ways to work through your mental and emotional, needs essentially.
Yeah, I agree. Go ahead.
No, go for it, Liz.
Oh, no, I was just agreeing with it because so one of the things that I'm learning about myself in this program is that um so even I'm also a disabled veteran, and so what I've learned is and even listening to when Daniela was speaking about accommodations, it's the struggle of just being able for veterans to go to the accommodations or disability services to identify some of those disabilities that we have challenges with. And one of the things I recently noticed when I started this program in the fall was that I didn't realize how much anxiety I have in public speaking, but in my job, I'm completely fine. And I don't know what it is about virtual. But when I went to actually speak to a mental health, it's crazy because I do mental health counseling. But things that I'm learning about myself because I had to unlearn through this program is that some of the triggers that I have from being in the military have resurfaced because of the things that I'm learning now. And so some of the things are really hard for me to speak about in class or listen to, which is why I have a hard time articulating what I want to say or what I am thinking. Because when I write it, it's completely like everything's there and it comes out just fine. But speaking has become very difficult for me. And I'm learning even just the last class in presenting that I had to learn and I've been practicing to like slow things down because everything in my mind races so fast. But just the fact that like I didn't even recognize that until more recently, but even just working to advocate for veterans, I'm like, I'm not even applying this to myself and understanding like where I need to work on things. So yeah, this reflection paper is going to be really interesting to write about too.
Yeah. It took me a while to accept my disability. If it wasn't for my best friend who taught me to accept myself and love myself, she was the one who actually like um how I got, how I'm getting emotional. She was the only person in that class who actually raised her voice and kind of told the professor off and the student off, and for her, like the professor got fired, and and we all got like a passing grade because she got fired like mid fall semester, and since then like I was always embarrassed with my display until my best friend's like you can't, because if you going to need to advocate for yourself in the future, I'm not always going to be there, which is she's not wrong. And I think so it wasn't until I got into my master's that's when I really challenged myself and really was put into like my internship was working at the display office, and that's when I learned so much about myself, but also like students as well, hearing different stories. My supervisor who also had a disability doing like a really good job and everything. I think for me, I was having a hard time because like my disability, I have a mild intellectual disability. So before it was known as mental retardedness, excuse my language. So it was written in my paper. So people saw it as like, oh, you're not capable of going to college, or you're not capable of being independent. Because when people hear intellectual disability, they think of taking care of a child instead of like an adult. And I found this video on TikTok. I sent to you guys. You guys could watch it anytime. But he also has an intellectual disability, and he's doing an amazing job. But the way he described it, it's literally like how I describe it to people. It's not because um, I don't I'm not on the age level, but I am. It's just like my brain thinks differently. It takes a process to learn things slower. So sometimes when I'm stressed out, that's when it affects my speech impediment, or when I'm nervous, it does that. But like I tell students, and I tell this to all my students because I work in the disability field as a disability specialist at UCLA. So every time when I meet new students, I always vocalize saying, I'm a person with a learning disability, so I'm here to advocate for you. I'm here to understand your disability. I'm not here to question about your disability. Because again, everyone's disability is different, not everyone's the same. So I always make sure that students hears that, because I feel like sometimes during the intake process, they feel like they need to over explain. So I want to make sure they feel as comfortable as they want, and also share what they feel comfortable sharing.
Mm. Did you have a chance to exchange your thoughts, or still okay? So we can go back then.
Recording in progress.
All right, everybody, welcome back. And we're going to take the next 10 minutes or so, like briefly chatting about what your takeaways are from your small group share outs. So what did you think about? I mean, I'm not going to, go breakout group by breakout group, but I'm going to ask anyone who wants to talk about any takeaways that you got from the smaller group, or your own paper writing process. What did you learn, or any takeaways from yours or your group members' takeaways from their papers that you wanted to share out to the whole group? So Christopher says self-authorship. Self-authorship is something that we're going to discuss in our class. In the next couple of weeks, we have a self-authorship as the unit title and how it may impact preserving your culture of origin. What is self-authorship? I know that I haven't assigned you to the readings yet, but those of you who have some prior knowledge on that, can we just define it briefly so that everyone is on the same page on that one? Yeah, Christopher, you just learned it because Erin says construct one's own beliefs, identities, and social relationships. So this is about like giving oneself an agency, okay? Agency to do the things that we think will be healthy for individuals to do, okay? And also perform actions, right? So their self-concept about themselves and also like their actions that stem from their positive identity about themselves and also performances, okay, and impact that they make as a result of that. It's the whole process is called self-authorship. Okay, so the goal is how do we make sure that we help our students implement self-authorship, right? I think that's the goal of educators and in higher education too. So based on that, we're going to talk about, many the student development theories too. Erica, you had your hand up. Did you want to talk about
Yeah,
this?
so I also use a couple of us use self-authorship, but it's basically when you stop asking about what others think of you and stop allowing others to define you, and when you start to step into a space of this, like kind of like describing who you are.
Mhm.
So I know we were just talking about student athletes,
Mhm.
and when you are no longer a student athlete, who are you after that? So there's a journey of self-authorship in trying to develop or redevelop your identity away from being considered in that category.
Mhm. Thank you. So thank you for using a concrete example of student athlete and how like student athlete will be forming their own self-authorship, right? Through the process of interacting with wider world. I mean, we should not forget the fact that the whole notion of student development is socially constructed, right? And while recognizing social constructed nature of identity forming process, ultimately students themselves to develop self-authorship to define who they are. Okay, so this is like a little summary that I wrote based on what you have said. Anything else? Any other highlights from your takeaways from the small group discussion?
In our group, we all had a connecting theme. And for us, we sort of talked about how the voices of marginalized people, they're often ignored, especially when it comes to student services or student affairs and higher education. And so to acknowledge them and to give validation to their experiences and their navigations of life, not just college, but life, is something that has been helpful from this program for us individually as well as a collective when it comes to what it is that we do respectively for our jobs. And so I thought that was really helpful to um, not just want to study that on my own, but to know that other people intersect and are also doing it in their own way. And so one of the readings that we've had, I put in the chat, one of my favorite quotes so far, and probably one that I'll be using in my dissertation, is all about looking at how populations should be honored and privileged as experts of their own experiences and as knowledge generators, because they are. They're just not validated um, uh, in the norms of society as they are set now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ernest. As the voices of marginalized people are often ignored, it's a validation to their lives, not just that their, presence should be given to them by the educators. So that's good, like grand missions that we all have. The question is, how do we do that in a way that's effective, right? So that's the part that we're all concerned about. So knowing about development theories really help us to understand who our students are and what they're going through. They might be going through, okay, it's all very different, but still it gives us some foundational details about how they are developing, and it helps us to like design some student specific guidelines to help them out and support them further. Thank you, Ernest. Anything else? So Anthony, in the chat, is it critical for autonomy, personal purpose, and lifelong learning? This helps in developing leadership. This is about self-authorship, right, Anthony?
Yes.
Okay. So I put that under self-authorship. That's nice. Nice preview of what we're going to talk about next week or the week after when we talk about self-authorship. What else did you talk about? What did you learn? What type? I overheard some of you talk about the methodology and of the research that you are critiquing and how you were saying, the participants number is too small. The size is too small. And what did you think about that? The qualitative research, oftentimes we have less number of people compared to quantitative sample size, right? I know this is the discussion for your methodology course, but since you talked about it, I wanted to bring it up because, there's like pros and cons to that. Samreen.
So I wanted to share a bit about the article that I used for my research paper. It was about unmet psychosocial needs among first generation college goers. And it was utilizing Chickering's theory. So it was actually applying Chickering's theory. So one of the things that we had talked about was the sample size and how the researcher interviewed 20 students at a private university that was part of a low income, program, and how many of the participants, they were first generation, but many of the participants were also from a low income, and many of the participations were also from minoritized group. So these students will have those intersectionalities that are not really addressed in the research, right? But when you have such a low sample size, how do you capture the impact of those intersectionalities? So that was kind of an interesting discussion that we were starting to have.
Mm-hmm. So that's very interesting conversation. I have a short response to that, and I don't want to make it too long because this is the whole methodology course discussion. But I'm a qualitative researcher myself, so I can speak to that. Is that if your research for some reason did not talk about intersectionality of your participants, then I think that there is a huge gap in the potential analysis that the researcher could have had on the analysis of the research findings. The primary goal of qualitative research with smaller size, usually, if you're my student under my guidance, if I'm your chair, I would be saying, if you're interested in doing qualitative research, depending on your research questions, right? And then I wouldn't recommend more than 15 participants. And I think this is true for most of the chairs too, is 15 people is more than enough rich data that you're going to get. And you're probably not going to use all the data anyways, because it's too rich for you to include all the data in your dissertation. The reason for that is you are in qualitative research with smaller size, and you pick out smaller size on purpose because you want to go into their lives very deeply, right? And talk about like intersectionality or what they're feeling, what they're saying, their perspectives, right? In a very detailed way. So with quotations and their perspectives. And your goal as a qualitative researcher is not to generalize. There is a huge confusion between quantitative research and, I mean, when you're trying to understand quantitative research goal and qualitative. Qualitative research, the goal of it is not to generalize, okay? Quantitative research is for you to generalize, right? So if you have like 90% of people, right, who valued, diversity in my small rural community, then, you can safely say maybe other rural cities in other United States, and you might say they have a similar findings there, okay, with similar demographics. For example, that's quantitative research. You're trying to generalize, right? Qualitative research is that you are trying to understand the perspectives of these participants. And you are not generalizing, but you're applying the findings that you got, and you are coming up with your findings are emerging. So for example, you might say your findings might be something like, oh, based on my participants' perspectives, okay, my participants value the use of AI, okay, in their studies, but they were really hesitant because while they see the value of it, they were really hesitant because they were worried about, the issue of plagiarism, okay? If that's a finding, then you might say, oh, there are some concerns around the use of AI, even though these students in higher ed, they're readily using AI. So this could be a question for other research, including other quantitative research. Now then, let's look at it from different lenses using quantitative lenses. Let's use a bigger size to see if these would be true for larger sample size, right? And using survey questions. So you are coming up with some common themes that would emerge from these findings, and rather than trying to generalize exactly. So for example, you can't really say, oh, this student is from low income status and also from Latino background. And therefore, when this student said this student does not like to use AI, therefore the other Latino students who are from the lower socioeconomic status, may not use AI. It does not directly generalize, apply that way. But you are coming up with some consensus, some common themes that emerge from the qualitative studies, and you can use it as some kind of findings, right? So there are some overall concern, okay, and there are some concerns about, ethical use of AI, and possibly, but they use it readily. They think it's really effective, but they also think, have a concern, okay, and also concern over reliance of it. Okay, so we want to maybe pose them as some kind of potential concern, okay, for other researchers who are reading this research, to see if these are some common themes that might be coming out of that, rather than saying, oh, this will be directly generalizable to those same population or similar population with similar demographics. Does that kind of ring the bell? I know that it was really short speech, but because it's for different research questions. So for qualitative research, you're essentially asking research questions like this, okay? How and why? Okay, if you're interested in how and why questions, why do international students use AI so readily? If those are your questions, for example, research questions, then you want to do qualitative research. If you're interested in doing, for example, asking questions like this, okay, which group of college students use AI more readily than others? Which groups, like which ethnic groups of students, for example, then you want to do quantitative research. Does that make sense? So it really depends on your research questions, and the methodology comes after that. Okay. So just because that sample size is small, should not be the reason why we should be critiquing a research. Okay. If the research used smaller study, but then they did not really tear apart, right? Like a, like a intersectionality, just like what Samreen said, that you see as a readers from the findings. The findings should be really, really transparent from both quantitative and qualitative, especially so for qualitative research. You should be, as a reader, you should, and also researcher, you should be able to reveal raw data, okay, as much raw data as possible when you're making an argument. That becomes a piece of evidence, okay? When you make an argument, so for example, the students really liked the use of AI, then you should be showing the evidence of what the student said, okay? The quotation, the raw data that goes with that. So when the readers are reading that raw data, and if you have a different interpretations, then you should be critiquing that. The student said this, but I don't interpret that as what the researcher interpreted it as, right? So I don't think that the researcher had a correct interpretation of what the student said. Okay, then that should be the point of critique. Am I making sense? So just because sometimes it's a limitation. Okay, smaller sample size is a limitation. But if you want to critique it, and I think all the research should be critiqued because we cannot survey everyone in the whole world all under one study. So I don't want to make it too long, but if you want to chat, I'm happy to chat further on this. But this is something that I wanted to share since we talked about the sample size. But you're right on, because you are also wanted to talk. I wanted you to talk about limitations of the study that you're critiquing. So I'm glad that you're talking about sample size. But since you're all going to be dealing with sample size in your own research anyways, I just wanted to bring this up so that we understand the goal of the studies based on the sample size. Everybody? Yeah? Okay. So you were freezing for a moment. So, okay, I cannot read your facial expressions. Everyone good? Okay. Questions? No? All right, then let's go ahead and start with discussion leaders presentation. So whenever you're ready, let me just make sure that I give you the rights. There you go. So whenever you're ready, just share your slides and we're ready for you.
Good evening, everybody. I know you're probably tired like me. It's hot. It's a Tuesday. We got like 3 or 4 more weeks. Hang in there. You can do it. Okay, Erica, give me thumbs up if we can see the screen. Fantastic. I'm so happy to be here with my team, Erica and Yang, and we're going over chapter 4 of Garvey and Patton this week, and we'll carry some themes into our research panel after this as well. We chose the main highlights of these 2 chapters, which is multiracial identity, acculturation, a word that I've been pronouncing wrong my whole entire life, but that's my Southern accent. It is what it is. So if I get it wrong, you're free to laugh. And then in relationship with international students, so seeing those 2 things in practice. We'll start off with acculturation and biculturalism. I first want to say and offer this perspective to you that I had conflated acculturation and assimilation. And I want to draw some a critique to that and something that I learned. So acculturation is keeping parts of your, I call it home identity or identity of, or not home identity, excuse me, origin of culture. Gosh, I'm tired. Your home culture or live culture, keeping parts of it as you experience a new culture, a host culture, or dominant cultures, given different terms throughout the reading. But assimilation is you're letting go of that culture of origin and you are fully assimilating to mainstream or the dominant culture. So wanted to separate the two just in case you were like me and you put the two together. I tend to do that. So let's get into bicultural acculturation. So it's an example of essentially take a person who is, I don't know, we could say Black American or African, and they're here in the US, let's say for school, we'll talk about international students later, and they're keeping that culture of origin with them, as well as fully participating in the host or dominant culture. And the two go hand in hand. They're not in competition with one another. And the Garvey describes that as bicultural acculturation. There is a call out to Latino orientation as an example of acculturation where um, the pockets of the US, you see that, particularly with Latino and Hispanic communities, where hanging on to that culture of origin and not necessarily adapting to or making changes or receiving the host or dominant culture. The Anglo orientation, which I thought was quite interesting, you see that from different perspectives, but we all may have experienced that to some degree. But where a person is letting go or allowing the dominant culture or the host culture to, um, I almost said assimilate. See, I almost did it again. They're taking on and actively engaging with the dominant culture and letting go of more parts of their uh, culture of origin. Last one is marginal acculturation is talked about, and Garvey kind of glossed over this one, so I had to dig a little bit deeper because I thought it meant that a person has been rejected from their culture of origin and the new host or dominant culture, mainstream culture. Let's use that term going forward. Mainstream culture, and it's not that at all. It's that the person themselves has decided to let go of or reject their culture of origin, and they're also rejecting the dominant or mainstream culture. And when you doing some further reading and listen to some stories about it, it could feel quite isolating. But I watched some stories about queer non-binary folks who may have their culture. There was a young lady who was Muslim and said, "Hey, I'm not accepted in my culture of origin, so I'm letting it go. I'm rejecting it." And then I'm here in America and in my city, as a non-binary person who also functions as queer and so on and so forth. I'm not accepting that culture either. I'm just going to let them both go. And some stories said, hey, I'm functioning in sovereignty. I am above those systems or those descriptors. So culturation is adjusting to different cultures. And there's an example of, you may have heard the term like the melting pot or the salad bowl. And think of acculturation more of the salad bowl where you have distinct pieces. I can't remember if we said that in this class or another class, but you have distinct pieces and parts of the salad that are still distinguishable and they're not melding together like a melting pot. The melting pot would represent assimilation. So the framework that we're highlighting here and using throughout our presentation, multiracial and international student perspective, is the model of multiple dimensions of identity. And this is basically saying, what framework or lens can I provide to you in student development as a way to help students form an identity or any individual form an identity? So they give us three lenses of meaning making. And this is when you get into Patton chapter 4. So what are the influences or what are the parts that are not as straightforward when you talk about like your race? I'm a Black male, what was that, race, gender, class, middle class, Christian, for example, could form my identity under this framework. But they give us some reminders that my core values and how I see myself can be influenced by outside pressures, making me either more strong or attached to my self view or identity, or it can make me a little bit uh, what do you call it? A little more anxious about it or a little bit weaker, as the text say. And so the context does matter about how someone sees themselves and how they put together their identity under the MMDI model. Cognitive complexity is a reminder that someone may be using their outside influences, their environment, to shape their identity. It reminds us that, campus norms, their friends, stereotypes in their daily life could be a part of how they're identifying with different dimensions. As a watered down example, you got to get into the text. Patton went a little deep in that. Interlocking systems is a reminder that there's different acculturation and how we choose to do it, at what level. We talked about the different level of examples, can be shaped by different parts of our life, depending on how we became attached to or chose affinity through race, gender, class, and religion. There's a shout out to Abe's as well. There was a call out to one of the chapters about really getting into cognitive complexity. I thought that was quite interesting for anybody in psychology background. So we understand acculturation, different from assimilation. We have a model here of choosing different dimensions to form an identity. And now it's what can you do with that to influence student identity in your campus or in your environments. So the first direction we were giving, I love the term minority stress to inform this lens as part of the presentation, and I think that is in Patton. I could be wrong, somebody correct me on that. But it says, hey, you should question default norms on your campus. Recognize what the default norms are and how they connect to dominant groups. Check the learning environment. Are we respecting different lenses of culture and or requiring the student to fit in? That's the burden. Put the burden on the institution instead of the student. So instead of saying to the student, we hear this a lot, I'm guilty of it, you need to be more professional. Remember what that really means, what the hidden meaning behind that means when it reflecting on acculturation. But really look at how much is the institution putting the burden on the student to fit in, and we can do more to challenge that. Think about the support model for the whole student. Zoom out and get holistic. Remember that culture affects the lens of race, class, and gender. A lot of that, particularly with race, is a Western term. If you came from a country or a culture where everyone looks like you and everyone's functioning through the culture in an original way. And then you get to color that salad bowl, that be mindful that that person's lens on race, class, and gender may be different through the effects of their culture. So it says to zoom out and be holistic. So we got a framework and a model. We distinguish acculturation versus assimilation. And I'm pass it off to Erica, who's going to get into multiracial. And I love this term, transracial. Erica, you might not talk about it today, but pass it on to Erica to get into the next part.
Yeah, so I focused on multiracial identity. The reason transracial is not mentioned in the theory, but it did pop in my head as a non-canonical, um, I guess like a non-canonical term that we try to use now, which doesn't technically function properly. But multiracial focuses on students who have more than one racial background and helps us understand how they develop their identities over time. Rather than assuming identity fits neatly into one racial category, this theory recognizes that many people experience identity in more complex ways. One of the main ideas is that there can be a difference between how individuals see themselves and how other people see them. For example, a student may identify with multiple racial backgrounds, while classmates, professors, or even institutional forms may categorize them as belonging to only one group. So somebody who is biracial could be categorized as solely Black or even solely Hispanic, but most of the time it's dependent on your aesthetic and how you look to society. So those outside labels don't always match a person's lived experience, which is why the transracial actually came to mind, because some people do classify themselves as transracial because they don't feel like the way that they look coincides with their lived experiences. But also, this theory is important because it challenges the idea that identity should not be determined by society. Instead, it emphasizes that people have the right to define themselves. It recognizes that identity is personal, fluid, and shaped by both individual experiences and social interactions. For educators and student affairs professionals, perspective reminds us that we shouldn't make assumptions based off of appearance or demographic categories alone. Instead, we should create spaces where students can express their identities in ways that feel authentic to them. So that's why we have like BSUs or other like cultural spaces on campuses as well. Ultimately, multiple racial identity theory helps us better understand the unique experiences of students whose identities don't fit into traditional racial categories, and why respecting self-identification is an important part of supporting student development. Next slide. Some central themes for this theory. The first is authenticity of the core. This means that a person's own understanding of who they are should take priority over how others perceive them or label them. The second theme is complexity and diversity of multiracial experiences. There isn't one universal multiracial experience, as every person's identity is influenced by their family, culture, community, personal history, and life experiences. So two students technically can be from similar backgrounds but won't have the same experience. Like I had a student in the past um, who the institution kept trying to label him a black man, but he said, I'm a black man from Nashville. And then, so on the opposite side, we had another black man from New York. So same racial backgrounds, but their lived experiences were different. And then the third theme is a collective identity and shared belonging. While every person's story is unique, many multiracial individuals also find strength in connecting with others who have similar experiences. These shared communities can provide validation, understanding, and a sense of belonging without requiring everyone to have identical experiences. And then for the key concepts, the first is individual self. It's at the center of multiracial identity is a person's own voice. Identity belongs with how someone understands themselves based on their own experiences, family history, and personal growth, just not on how others perceive them. This concept emphasizes that self definition should come from before outside should come first before outside labels. The second concept is collective identity. While self identification is important, people also develop identity through relationships with others. Many multiracial students find community with people who share similar experiences of navigating multiple racial backgrounds. These relationships can strengthen their confidence and help them feel less isolated. And then finally, I basically call it the umbrella multiracial identity. So this reminds us that multiracial identity is not one single experience. It includes people from many different racial, cultural, and family backgrounds. Some individuals may identify strongly with all parts of their heritage, while others may feel more connected to one background depending on their experiences. The key takeaway is that the theory avoids oversimplifying identity. Instead, it recognizes the diversity, complexity, and individuality within multiracial communities. And so this theory matters because one of the biggest contributions is that it places the student's own voice at the center of identity development, similar to what it mentions with the core. So rather than relying on labels assigned by others, educators should recognize and respect how students identify themselves. The theory also reminds us that although multiracial students may share common experience, every student story is unique. There isn't a single correct way to be multiracial, so educators should avoid making assumptions of or expecting students to explain or justify their identities. Another important point is that all multiracial experiences deserve recognition. Students shouldn't feel pressure to choose one racial identity over another or fit into a category that doesn't reflect who they are. In practice, educators can create more inclusive classrooms by allowing students to define themselves using inclusive language and acknowledge the complexity of identity. They can also create opportunities for students to share experiences if they choose, while making sure that students never feel responsible for representing an entire group. The goal is to create environments as educators where students feel seen, respected, and supported as a whole individual. When institutions recognize identity as something personal, and evolving, they help students develop a stronger sense of belonging.
All right, my session is about international students. So before I start, I'd like to leave with one thought to keep you in mind throughout my presentation. Around the world, universities are competing to attract the brightest international students, scholars, researchers, not only because they contribute to the economy, of course they do, but because to drive research, innovation, and global learning. Yet attracting talent is only the first step. If we cannot create a campus where international students feel supported, valued, respected, and they truly belong, the United States risks losing its competitive leadership to the countries such as UK, Germany, Canada, or Australia, all of which continue to invest in global talent. As someone who has spent past 10 years to support the international population, today's rating really challenged me to look beyond the culture and nationality and recognize how the model of multiple dimension of identity as MMDI provides a more comprehensive way to understand students' identity development and better support their success. Beyond acculturation, reframing international students' identity, I'd like to start with what I think the most important insight from today's rating. Traditionally, we have understood international students through the lens of acculturation, how they adapt to a new culture. The author Garvey reminds us that identity develops through the interactions between students' home and host cultures, and that campus climates influence this process. Then author Patton, however, challenges us to look beyond adaptation. The theory of MFDI reminds us that international students are much more than their nationality or culture. Their identity are dynamic and shaped by interaction of race, the language of the speaking, religion, gender, immigration status, academic identity, and many other life experiences. As someone who works with international students every day, I see this firsthand. Two students from the same country, they can experience the same classroom, same professor, same university policies, yet respond very differently. One student may view constructive feedback as opportunity to grow, while another students may see this as a sign they don't belong at all. So acculturation alone cannot fully explain those differences response. So the theory of MFDI can, because it's recognized that students interpret their experiences through their own meaning-making process, shaped by their multiple identities and the context in which they live and learn. For me, the greatest contribution of today's rating is this shift in perspective. Our responsibility is not only to help international students adapt, but to understand the complexity of their identity so we can create a learning environment where every student feels supported, valued, and truly belongs. Next slide, please. Applying MMDI to international students. This slide explains why I think the theory of MMDI is such a powerful framework for understanding international students. The first component is self-perception. MFDI reminds us that no international student is defined just one identity. A student may be Chinese, a first-generation college student, Muslim or engineer major, or a F1 visa holder, simply at that, or all at once. Together, these identities influence how students understand themselves and how they navigate their college experiences. The second component is meaning making, and I believe this is part of MMDI. Students don't simply experience events, they interpret them. That interpretation is shaped by their cultural backgrounds, family values, previous experiences, confidence, and the identities that matter most in that moment. The third component is context. Identity does not exist in isolation. It's changed with the environment. Immigration policies, classroom expectations, faculty interactions, campus climate, or even a single conversation that influence which identity become the most important. For example, a student's visa status may be the most important during an immigration appointment, while racial or religion identity may become more significant in other situations. Finally, identity salience reminds us that international students are not one homogeneous group. The identity that matters most today may be different tomorrow because the students' experiences and the context are consistently changing. This is why I believe the MMDI frameworks builds on Garvey's work. Garvey helped us to understand acculturation and the importance of campus climate. while Patton shows us that identity is dynamic. It's multidimensional and shaped through the meaning making. To me, this just changes the conversation. International students are not simply adapting to a new culture. They're actively making sense of who they are as they navigating the life in the US higher education. Next slide, please. Implication of higher education practice. So what does this mean to higher education professionals? I believe our responsibility go beyond the helping international students adapt. We must also ask whether our institutions are adapting to meet the needs of today's diverse students. Traditional support, such as orientation, immigration advising, or language assistance or cultural adjustment are important, but it's not enough. The MMDI framework reminds us to see international students as whole people whose experiences are shaped not only by nationality, but also by race, gender, religion, social class, immigration status, and many other identities. It's also challenged us to create a policy, campus environment, and support and services that recognize this complexity. Finally, the MMDI framework reminds us that international students are not one homogeneous group. Every student brings different identities, experiences, and perspective. So our support should be just as individualized. I'd like to end with one final thought. International students cross national border to pursue an education here, but every day they also navigate multiple identities. Our responsibility as higher education professionals are not simply to helping them adjust to our institutions, but to build institutions that recognize, value, and support the full complexity of who they are. For me, this is the most important lessons from Garvey and Patton in today's rating and the MMDI framework. Thank you. I will pass to Chris.
All right, Dr. Min, would you mind giving me a time check for this breakout? How are we doing?
Okay, let's do this. Why don't we take a break? Is that okay?
Yes,
10
totally
minutes
fine.
and then come back and I'll get you all ready for breakouts. And then when we are back in 10 minutes, I think
Perfect.
it's
Thank
about
you.
time for do that. Okay. See you all in 10 minutes.
Dr. Min, how long do you think we got on the breakout rooms? I'm so sorry I lost track of time for the discussion activity.
Excuse me?
For the discussion activity, how are we doing on time?
You're doing great.
Great, okay.
Okay, so how much time do you need in the breakout?
Honestly, less than 10 if we got it.
Okay, I'll hop around to ask you if you're ready to come back. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, everybody, welcome back. I just gave you the breakout group, so please push the button so you can.
It's good to see your face.
Good to see you too.
Okay, is this my group? You know it's the VIP group. You already know. Somebody remove the velvet ropes. You know what I'm saying? Oh man, Ernest is here. Oh man. Oh man. So I thought it would be fun. Like, I always love application activities. I don't know, this might be my teaching background. I don't know. So we have the MMDI framework, which is basically considering race, class, gender, religion, and having the student make sense of that and connect to, figuring out where they fall in that. I'm going to say classification system. I know that the readings hate that, but dimensions, if you will, and apply it to. We talked about multiracial identity and some considerations there. We talked about the international students. Yang gave her perspective on that, and Patton's offering some of the reading. So now let's put it to practice. Let me see. You're going to be an advisor, and you have a student come into the office, and student says, our scenario here is, imagine you're an academic advisor and a first year scholarship student from Nigeria, Nanambi, comes to your office feeling stressed and alone. We know that that has happened. You may have experienced that in the classroom in our different environments. And Nanambi says, I feel like I don't fit in anywhere. Southern accent acting up when I get sleepy. Forgive me. In my STEM classes, the rules and expectations feel unclear and strict. When I went to the Black Student Union to find community, I also felt out of place, which is a real thing between Black Americans and Africans. It's a whole situation. Put it into Google. My immigrant background and way of thinking did not match American campus activism. I do not think I belong here. So MMDI, patent perspective, and a little bit of Garvey says, consider the filter. So how is the school culture making it hard for this student to understand their experience? Look at the interactions. So how is race, immigrant status, and academic setting working together here? Excuse me. And then action. Instead of telling the student to adjust or fit in, which I've been guilty of as an advisor, I'm like, hey, friend, you want to be a medical doctor? There's professional standards. I get it. I know. Name 2 changes in the STEM department or student center, because they also mentioned that they went to participate in some student affair clubs. Some changes that the STEM department or student center could make or should make to better support the student's bicultural identity. I like to do thought bubbles that don't have to be drawn out, but what comes to mind for you from the framework of the filter, the intersections, or the action, all 3, or in part?
I feel like for me, it's easier to start with the STEM department just because they are,
That's where he's spending most of his time.
well, not only is that where he's spending most of his time, but I'm I'm pretty sure like STEM has a reputation of not being diverse. So,
White male centered for sure.
there's definitely probably a lot that can be done there to improve on the student experience. And I think
maybe even doing like focus groups or something with STEM students. And then this will help not only Namdi, I'm sorry.
Nanambi.
Say it again.
Nanambi.
Nanambi could help Nanambi find sort of that solidarity across differences, right? So if they see like, hey, like this person might look different than me, might have a different experience, but here in the space, we're having the same experience. Like we in our STEM classes, maybe we I'm pretty sure he's not the only one feeling lost and like they're really strict. Um, so
And
that's
he also
where
could be experiencing STEM from his own home country because it could be practice
right.
in
That's true.
Differently,
practice
right?
totally different. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I guess like 2 points, right? Just kind of building upon kind of like the STEM area. I think one of the areas that could be helpful is like if there's faculty or other students that this student can connect with, to kind of help like translate some of the information, right? Because I think
Oh,
that
that's
sometimes
good.
some of the
Yes.
verbiage that you might be used to, right? Or the
Oh, that's
style of
good.
learning, or even if we think about technology and learning, right? Like if you're using like a Canvas interface or Brightspace or something, right, for learning, to kind of translate some of, kind of like how do you do well academically here to kind of build that confidence and kind of like that belonging, right? Because then you have like a reason for meeting, right? It's kind of like you're new here, you're international, let's, help catch you up academically, or not catch you up, but kind of like trans I guess
Help
bring some
acculturate you.
congruence,
Mhm.
right? Of like what you've done in your home country and how that's articulated here. The other one was in the case study, it had mentioned that the academic advisor and coordinator for the ELS program um, is um, is Latina and was born and raised in Connecticut and is alumni of the program. So I think that could be another good resource to kind of connect with the other students that are also international, right? That also might be in the ELS program. So that could be another avenue to provide a little bit more support.
Oh, Fran, that was good. I wrote that down. Bridge making. We don't talk about that
Mhm.
enough in higher ed. Yeah.
I also think
Yeah.
too, it's been a while since I've done advising, but I would say um, building a support network is key. Also, just intentional check-ins. I know oftentimes depending on workload, depending on resources, oftentimes I know when I was at UCLA, I did have a huge caseload of students. So oftentimes check-ins weren't really as realistic. But when I worked at the School of Dentistry, where the student population was a little bit smaller because it was more focused on grad level students, I had the ability to actually do check-ins with students. So if they have the ability, but going back to building a support network, just in listening to everyone, I don't want to sound redundant, but I think helping them go back to, identifying people on campus that they can turn to, like a faculty member, maybe a counselor or a mentor. I find those things useful. And then one other thing that I wrote down here is to celebrate their culture identity. I think that's
Mhm.
important too.
And
I've
Una
learned,
connects to that in the chat too.
yep, I've
Yeah,
learned over the years
celebrate
that
it.
we have to do that for our international students.
And ask them, tell me about your culture. Tell me about where you're from. What is home? Like sometimes just giving them a brave space to talk about it.
Mhm.
You know what I'm saying? Get that little bit of dopamine and pride.
Mhm.
Yeah. I love
Agreed.
what Ernest said in the chat. He said, you absolutely belong here, but our environment hasn't fully supported you just yet. Let's make a plan.
Oh, that's good, Ernest. You want a job?
Wrote it down. I wrote it down. Anthony, I know we cut you off. Go ahead, friend. Anthony says responsibility should not solely be on that student. Yeah, we talked about that in presentation, right? Stop putting the burden on the student to fit in.
And this is another thing too. You know, one thing that I remember when I was in school, you know, they would automatically assume that you know, people from different countries, because of the color of their skin, they would put them in the black community. You know, and it's not you know, um,
Which we get it from the outside looking in, but internally within the culture,
right.
folks just
So
don't know.
I feel like, you know, and instead of telling the student to fit in, you know, clearly communicate the expectations for them being first year. But I also think that, you know, when the where there's a huge bridge builder, there would be where the academic advisors can talk about, like, hey, I understand that you're navigating through different identities. So how can I help you? Could be a good start.
Yeah, ask. Oh, you know what, friend? Something I learned as an advisor, and I'm 17 years in, is to ask them what my role is to support them. Sometimes they just want me to be a listening ear. Sometimes they want me to help them take action. They want me to help them get started to take action. Sometimes they just want to hear about my own experiences. Yeah. And I it's funny, I do that with my nieces and nephews. Like when I hear them complain and have cries of outrage. But I just, Anthony, that's so important. Yeah. Ask them what they want you to do, what role they want you to play. The bridge, the task starter, the connector, the builder. Yeah, that's huge. Is anyone, if the STEM department says, well, we have to focus on the rigor of that, we have to focus on the rigor. Here's what I hear from my faculty. And I don't disagree, but they say the rigor overrides culture because the rigor is what, and I had a faculty member say that to me. And I had to pause because it was another Black man. I was like, let me pause because from his perspective, I had to work to get used to this. And I know what's best, I know the one of the best routes for someone in similar shoes. And I said, okay, that's a perspective. Could be harmful if the person is not looking for that, if they're not ready for that. It also could be harmful to consider you're not wearing the same shoes. They're a size 10, you're a size 15. You wear gym shoes, they wear house shoes. Like that's all they got is a house shoe, trying to navigate academia, right? What would be your response? How, if a faculty member said that to you, and I try to respect their positions. My title is so annoying sometimes as dean, but um, he said, hey, we got to protect rigor and we got to think about programmatic accreditation. And it's not necessarily that we're ignoring it or not hearing it, but that's student affairs job. That's what the other half of your team should be doing. Because my life is split between academic affairs and student affairs. And they said, our job is to deliver the product that they bought. And X, Y, and Z. And I said, okay, well, and in my head, I'm like, they spend the most time with you in the classroom, engaged in academics. They don't spend nearly as much time with me outside of the classroom or with us outside the classroom. What would be if you went to challenge to America's point, you went to STEM and you start dialogue, right? Because you always got to do some idiosyncrasy credits, gather those credits, start some dialogue, hear some perspectives, then you sneak it in. What would you say to that? I ain't gonna tell you what I said because y'all know how, I went kaboom, but
I mean, I feel like so being in student services and knowing how siloed our instruction and student services is, I can totally see that, unfortunately. But I think
thank you,
it
Dr.
comes
May.
down, I think it comes down to two things. One is data, right? I would like to see what is the success rate of the students in your program, right? And is it representative of the student body or the community? And then I would challenge with that, right? So basically,
Comparative analysis, okay.
Are you saying that based on how students are performing in your program, are you saying that there's something biologically like they just can't do it, right? Is that, I mean, I wouldn't say it in those terms, but I would figure out a way to like have this conversation diplomatically. And I mean, I think also the thing is maybe also asking like, what are the values of the program? Like, do they value diverse student success? Like, and then we know where their starting point is, because if they don't, then we're gonna have to figure out a different.
That's it. And that's a good point to end on. Dr. Min, can you take us back?
Recording in progress.
I appreciate all the engagement. Wait, is everybody back? Where's everybody?
It's just our group.
Just us.
Oh, you got my heart rate up,
I
Christopher.
know that when when he said that to me, I said, I'm learning through therapy because bipolar medicated now. I didn't mean to go kaboom, but I said, tell me more about that. How do we get there? Yeah, what was your tell me about your experiences that led you to that? And I had no patience to hear his response, but I'm learning. I'm learning.
Talk about positionality.
Oh, I was like, I could give you less sections next term. That's what I wanted to say. All right, I think this is the bulk of us. Thank you for engaging in conversation, doing a little bit of role playing. I'm just going to share out just a smidge, and if anybody else feels compelled, drop it in the chat while I'm giving my little spiel here. A point of interest for me in our conversation was to help the student figure out or ask the student what your role is. So, do you want me to help? Do you want to be a listener? Do you want me to help you take action? Do you want me to be a bridge? Do you need me to be an advocate for you? Some other points of interest is intentional check-ins. I was thinking about what Dana said. I'm like, friend, my caseload is like 4, 5, 6, 7, 800 students, depending on what, I do wish I could do more check-ins, and there's a creative way to do that. Let me see, where's the chat at? We appreciate your time. If you think of anything else, drop it in the chat. Any cries of outrage? I didn't anticipate that. We appreciate your time, Dr. Min.
Right, thank you. Let's give them a big round of applause. Okay, I know that you have the research panel prepared next, right? And then this is like in continuation to what you have just discussed. So I'm gonna wait for you to finish that before we, give you our reactions. Okay, whenever you're ready.
Oh, let me adjust this tab right in here. Something's going on with the Wi-Fi. Why does it have to be today? Here we go. Welcome. My name is Christopher. I'm your host today. I'm hosting a conversation, a roundtable, critiquing MMDI. So I know you may have some familiarity with it. I'm going to guide you through this research panel. I'm joined by Jessica Harris and Lori Patton. And we're going to talk about an article that they wrote, some research that they did on intersectionality, what it means, what it doesn't mean, how it connects to MMDI, some challenges, some critiques, and some solutions. I want to tell you a little bit more about the research study in itself before we get into our research panelists. So the goal of this research study was to take a closer look at academic journals and articles that talk about intersectionality, and from the lens of MMDI, to see if one, if intersectionality was cited correctly. We're going to talk about what that means in regards to the originator of it, the original framework, and its origins. Is intersectionality being, if it's replacing if it's being conflated with MMDI. So in other words, is it just another term that we're using that they were using with MMDI? And does the substitutions, does it weaken the initial social justice lens of intersectionality? Intersectionality is a term coined by Black women during the Black feminist movement. We could take it from 1989 all the way to 2017. Dr. Crenshaw is still actively engaged. The originator of the word and the framework of intersectionality, she brought that to academia. Two theories here. One is obviously multiple dimensions of identity. Another one is other theory is intersectionality, which essentially the difference between the two, in case you're not familiar with the work, is intersectionality is examining the systems of power. We're zooming out. I gave an example in conversation earlier today. So MMDI says, hey, what race do you identify as? Do you make meaning as? And Dr. Crenshaw through intersectionality says we should probably be looking at racism itself and talking about how's that represented on your campus, those experiences, and look at it from structural inequities and how we can push back on that, how we can address that. Some major findings, just as a highlight, and then you'll hear from our research panelists today. 97 articles from peer review articles in higher education journals were looked at. 56 were found to use intersectionality as just, and that's my word, a token term. So if anybody gets offended, it is what it is. They just used it as a token term. They didn't talk about what it meant. There was no connections to the original social justice work. Nearly half of them gave no credit to any of the Black feminist originators when using the term. And for the most part, and they had a questionnaire that they used. So they used the questionnaire to address these questions essentially. And they realized that MMDI often replaces intersectionality in a lot of the articles, which were really perspectives, frameworks, and theories for student affairs and student development, which essentially was shifting the focus away from those systems that I described earlier into and narrowing the lens of social justice. Additional research, we're offered critiquing some solutions a little bit later. You'll hear the panelists talk about that, but the panelists or the researchers are basically saying and helping us to understand we need to zoom out a little bit more and do some more research on how MMDI can reintegrate intersectionality and or be a complement to intersectionality. So I'm going to pass it off to Jessica, which is Yang, and let her get started.
Yes. So what's the differences between MMDI and intersectionality? First of all, I'd like to briefly highlight our purpose. We're not proposing a new theory or arguing that MMDI is flawed. Instead, we challenge how higher education researchers has been using intersectionality and ask whether current research still honor its original social justice purpose. This distinction is important because these two frameworks were created for different purposes. MMDI is a student's development theory that explains how individuals understand, prioritize, and make meaning of their multiple identities over time. It focuses on identity development and meaning making. However, intersectionality was originally developed by Kimberly Crenshaw to explain how systems of power and oppression shape people's experiences. Rather than focusing only on identity, it examines how racism, classism, and other structures interact to produce inequity. So MMDI asks how students developed identities, while intersectionality asks why unequal experiences exist. Next slide, please. So this distinction helped answer the question of who the theory seeks to describe. Intersectionality was originally developed to explain the lived experiences of Black women, so whose experiences has been overlooked by both feminist movement centered on white women and anti-racist movements centered on Black men. So we explained that today's intersectionality has expanded into a broader framework for understanding students whose experiences are shaped by multiple intersections intersecting system of oppression, including race, gender, disability, immigration status, religion, and a social class. However, we argue that when researchers substitute the MMDI framework for intersectionality, we often overlooked the broader social, historical, and institutional forces shaping students' experiences. By focusing primarily on individual identity development, researchers may unintentionally ignore how university policies, immigration systems, racism, xenophobia, and economic inequality creates unequal educational opportunities. As international students and immigration professional, this point resonates deeply with me because many international students navigate multiple identities, but their experiences are also shaped by like visa policies, institutional expectation, or unequal power relationships. So in my own research on reporting barriers, students often feared reporting discriminations because of concerns about immigration status, future employments, or faculty relationships. These barriers are not simply identity issue. They reflecting structural conditions. This insights fundamentally changed how I think about supporting international populations in higher education. I will pass to Erica.
Okay, so for the first critique, one of the biggest concern is that researchers are forgetting where intersectionality actually came from. Of course, intersectionality was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw and some other Black feminists, such as Patricia Hill. So it explains how systems like racism and sexism interact to create a unique form of oppression. The MMDI model was designed to understand individual identity development. It's useful for understanding how students see themselves, but it wasn't intended to analyze social injustice or social or structural inequality. The authors argue that when researchers replace intersectionality with MMDI, they aren't just changing the terminology, they're removing the historical and political purpose behind intersectionality. And so for this particular slide, just to kind of like sum up what the images are, for me, the MMDI model is more like a tier system, almost like a hierarchy system. It is layering what they believe the start of your core to be and what the other identities are also within their particular structure, whereas intersectionality is an overlap of all of your identities in one, and how they operate simultaneously or in a synchronous way to present an individual. But the second critique focuses on what the authors calls, of course, added up approach. MMDI tends to view identities like race, gender, religion as separate categories that overlap, or not even just that overlap or layer on top of each other. It's helpful, but to understand somebody's identity, but it doesn't fully explain how systems of oppression work together. Intersectionality, of course, asks a different question. Oh, sorry. Instead of simply asking what identities someone has, it interacts to shape a person's experience. So MMDI mainly asks how students understand and develop their identities. That's valuable information, but the authors say it only tells a part of their story. Intersectionality asks us to examine the larger system that influences those experiences. And for MMDI, it's on the individual, while intersectionality focuses on both individual and the structure surrounding them. And then so the final critique is just like giving proper credit. The authors found out nearly half of the 97 research articles that they reviewed did not acknowledge Black women scholars who develop intersectionality. They argued that when researchers use the language of intersectionality but fail to recognize its origins or replace it with MMDI, they unintentionally erase the contributions of Black feminist scholars. This matters because theories don't exist in isolation. They are developed within historical and social context, and recognizing those origins help preserve the original purpose of the framework. The authors concluded that researchers should accurately credit intersectionality ordinance and avoid treating it as an interchangeable with models that were designed for different purposes.
Okay, for solution one, so we argue that the future research should start by examining how scholars are actually using the MMDI framework and intersectionality. We recommend tracking citation practice to determine whether researchers are unintentionally replacing intersectionality with MMDI framework and whether we continue to acknowledge the Black feminist scholars who originally developed intersectionality. This would help determine whether higher education research is still honoring intersectionality's original social justice purpose. Next, please. And solution two is we also recommend study the same students population use of both MMDI framework and intersectionality because the theory of the MMDI framework would help explain students' identity development, while intersectionality would examine the system of power surrounding those students. Comparing these approaches would help researchers understand when each framework is most appropriate and how they can complement one another rather than compete. I will pass to Chris.
All right, so what does this mean? Thank you to our research panelists. How can we take their hard work back to our colleges and different environments? And so the research is telling us through the lens of intersectionality, be more holistic, zoom out a bit, and further help the student to understand, yeah, it's not a you problem, is a social construct problem. And here's what that means from different lenses. Consider your programs. Are your programs leaning more towards MMDI? We talked about it's very additive. I use the term additive. It's this plus this plus this. And are you doing that to simplify the process of creating programs? The example that I led with that came to mind with this is we talked about learning circles or talking circles for those who have experienced sexism or who have been harmed by patriarchy. So groups of students come together that engage in that conversation and roundtable, and then you can get into their individual identities. And they get a chance to unpack that and bond from that lens. But you're zooming out at a macro level to talk about why is race a dimension? Why is sex or gender a dimension in the first place in relation to patriarchy? I could go on a whole rant about that. But consider how you're looking at your programs and what theories and lens inform them. There's got to be some training. Student affairs professionals. I wasn't even aware of where intersectionality came from until this particular research panel, these researchers put this together and did a critique of MMDI. And so taking that back to my campus and my groups and even opening a what we call a learning circle, a living learning circle with my team to say, hey, read this. What do you think? How does this work here? What can we do differently? How does this inform our lenses on our programs and offering some additional training? Inclusive policies. Now, inclusive, I realize in the current climate, we can't use words like that, but consider how you can integrate. There's another word. How can you integrate the lens of the macro level lens of the systems of oppression and harm and how they influence or really how the mainstream or dominant group is influencing policies and consider okay, should we challenge that? Is there some influence there? Most importantly, listen to student voices, give them an opportunity to tell you about their experiences because we can't assume. We shared out experiences about that previously. Yang gave us some great examples with international students. So give them an opportunity to talk. We'll end here. I appreciate hosting this research panel with you. I want to thank our panelists, and here are some key takeaways. Changing the history. We got to preserve the history as doctors. Know the history, carry it with you through your research. And that way we can pass it on to the undergrads and societies and our communities as a whole. Don't dumb it down. Don't do that. Get into the nuance and the nitty gritty because identities are nuanced and we can make meaningful connections when we don't dumb it down. We don't necessarily, it's not the easiest thing to do for that person, or as professionals to consider programming, but it's not additive and it's not that simple. Consider expanding your lens, which means you got to get uncomfortable. I was a little uncomfortable reading about intersectionality and its origins, to be honest with you. And Kimberly Crenshaw can be quite. The response I got from my faculty was, Kimberly Crenshaw is a little controversial, and maybe that's why they left it out. Blah blah blah. And I was like, okay, that's perspective. And when I did my research, I was like, okay, might be a little uncomfortable with it, but we're leading. We're leading through this lens, and we can set the other things aside. Again, I appreciate your time today for this research panel, and that'll conclude it.
Thank you for your clear and powerful presentations. Thank you. Before we move forward with my discussion question, I would like to hear from you on your reactions to any of the things that they have said in a discussion leading session, as well as during the research panel. Some of the keywords that I heard were acculturation, biculturation versus assimilation, collective identity versus individual identity, and MMDI construct, intersectionality, power, systems of power, and marginal status of certain groups. And women are, the crunch talking about intersectionality and how that's, we're neglecting the origin of how intersectionality came about from Black feminist perspectives. What do you all think about any of the things that they said? I really liked your point about the intersectionality and how sometimes, many times, is used as a tokenism, right? Tokenism. Intersectionality having multiple identities of individual. Yeah, but so what, right? What's the implications of intersectionality? I know you gave one example of how like it should be dealt with like a, bigger societal holistic way of understanding like individuals. So that's like one way. But when we're thinking about intersectionality and applied to your practice, what would be the implications that you want to use, for example?
I think for me personally, as I was doing this, the main thing that stuck out to me was the core and where somebody's core is. I think every individual has a different core. It doesn't mean like your identities, kind of like MMDI, they do try to create like a hierarchy system with identities. And it's like, who's to say how that's supposed to start for somebody? Because you also have to understand like the realization of race doesn't begin when you're born. There's a certain like system of like almost like policies on how to behave as a particular race of person. That's not necessarily your core, nor is it like necessarily who you are. So like sometimes even with this particular theory, I feel like they should have also talked about spirituality and how core could be rooted in that as well. But when it comes down to like intersectionality, I like that it mentions the structures around the individual and how that also can affect a person's development, but also just because you have one identity that could potentially, be a binary to your other identities, it doesn't negate the fact that it still exists. So you could be oppressed, but also have systems of privilege within your oppression. So it doesn't mean just because you are in an oppressed neighborhood, do you have to solely exist as an oppressed person? You can actually implement forms of privilege in that oppression.
Thank you. So eloquently said, Erica. So to piggyback on what you just said, I'm going to be emphasizing the word salience. Okay. Identity salience, something that the discussion leaders have said about intersectionality, right? And also MMDI. So a certain part of your identity become salient in a given context, for example, right? So, Erica, you gave us an excellent example of that. And also, it occurred to me just now that I'm in the States. Back in Korea, when I was there for a couple of weeks, and I was more prone to my identity as a woman, okay, than my minority status, ethnic minority status here in the States. I guess I'm more conscious of my identity as ethnic minority here in the States, more so than in Korea. Obviously, it's more, homogeneous country when it comes to ethnicity there. And I'm more like women, it's more, we talked about like patriarchy and also how like men is dominant, has a dominant power, especially so in South Korea. And how like when I'm making a complaint and I felt like I had to bring my husband with me to do that more effectively there in that context, right? To navigate and to take my advantage of the things that I want to really pursue, okay, in that particular context. Meaning that I am utilizing my identity and also using my tools to make sure that I take advantage of the things that I want to pursue, right? So in that particular context. So more so than here, right? So here is different. Than I'm constantly reminded that I'm an ethnic minority here. So it's like more salience of certain parts of identity that's coming out of me in different contexts. So I think that that what we need to also think about as educators in practice, and then we need to make sure that, oh, depending on where the students are at, okay, not just situations or not just physical context, but where they're in academic context, social, international students coming here and in a foreign country, for example, different context, what identities are more salient for them at the time, given the context they're in, right? So maybe serving them in that regard would be good. And also like preparing yourselves to serve them, serving their needs based on their different identities that might come up based on different needs that they have at the time would be important. My question, I have another question. I don't know if you recall, but last week we ended up with this question. I asked you to think about that, right? Can Black or racial ethnic identity development theories be foundational to understand and discuss MMDI, intersectionality, accommodation, assimilation, collective identity, other forms of racial identities, blah, blah, blah. So I think this was the question that you posed in a chat, Christopher, last week, right? So we talked about racial identity last week. And for example, cross Nigerian, Nigerian's identity, right? And for example, so Black racial identities, and it's very foundational. I'm posing this question because this is like can go both ways. I'm not going to say it's controversial, but some people say yes, this is definitely foundational. Other people say, maybe not. So let's talk about some of the things that come to your mind about about this, the topic of racial identities, how they can be applied or can be expanded upon to think about multiracial or MMDI, intersectionality, accommodation, biculturation, so on and so forth. I'm gonna let you think about it, and then when you're ready, you're more than welcome to raise your hand or put it in the chat. What was Cross Nigressen's model from last week? By Dr. William Cross. Laura, you want to go give it a shot?
Yeah, from what my understanding was, it's like a development theory on Black racial identity, and there's different development stages.
Yes.
And I and you can go through the different stages based on different life events.
Life events, or it could be the interactions with other people, or it could be the materials they interact with, or the situations they're in, or experiences, education, so on and so forth. Thank you, Laura. Definitely. Life stages that you go through becoming Black as an identity, or having a Black identity, and it's also called, in other words, a psychology of becoming Black, right? And let's see. Christopher, you said this one is tough because Black American development theories are rooted in such deep American history that not all populations have experienced. Okay, and Ernest said Cross, the theory outlines how Black identity is functionally enacted in everyday life through behaviors that give direct meaning to the term collective identities. Okay. Good, thank you. So that might be a way for us to understand collective identity. Erica, go ahead, take it away.
So I started thinking about this of why in the States Black identity or Black culture is kind of like a representation for other marginalized groups. I don't think that's fair. But for me, it kind of came down to the binary oppositions of Black and white, which
Yeah.
is consistently what America is built on. And that also stems from a whole lot of like other stuff. But I don't think that what we experience as a group should be a representation of what others experience, because it's kind of taken away from their experiences as well. But I do understand why the larger policyholders believe that Black people are supposed to be, identifiers for the marginalized problem, or try to give a perspective of what it's like to be a marginalized person.
Thank you, Erica. And you said both sides really, really nicely. So those people who argue that okay, Black racial development theories are foundational, and I think both are true, because these foundational theories really we said foundational, right? These are foundational to understand, and make other theories can branch out. Okay, it's based on some of the things that would emerge as based on what Black racial ethnic identities developments say. Okay, this is similar to what I said before about qualitative research study. And although Black racial identity development theories cannot be directly applied to, for example, Asian international students' identity development, but still you can kind of see, what happened and what emerged as findings for these theories. For example, pre-encounter, encounter, immersion, and internalization. So at the end of the day, according to this particular theory, okay, Cross said, and the Blacks become Blacks and they have their identities at the end of the day by encountering with others and thoughts, and they internalize their thoughts and they make sense within themselves, and they socialize with others to make meaning of who they are as a Black people. Christopher, you have a hand up.
One, I want to celebrate you for bringing that up, because that's key right there. That's it. I would offer the perspective that the systems of oppression have been mostly used on Black people. So therefore, as other minority and marginalized groups experience those systems, they have to look somewhere or they have to, one, be made aware of it. And so two, then how do I navigate it? And then three, how do I make sense of this in terms of my identity, my belongingness to the culture, so on and so forth. So when I applied that lens to it, and the reason I say that is because one of my students brought that to my attention in one of our BSU circles. She said, I'm a Mexican American from Redwood City. And I looked to my Black friends experience from the third lens, and I go, oh dang, I'm experiencing some of the same stuff. But I see how they're navigating it, and that's how I learned learn to navigate it. Another one of my students coming from Ukraine, and he said, I didn't know anything about this race stuff. I have no idea what y'all talking about, but I have a Black teammate and I see how he's treated and I'm learning about these different systems. And now I understand through that observation where I fit. And so I would offer that perspective. It's less about if Black foundational theories are appropriate to be used for other marginalized groups. It's really the most present to you as a way to make meaning of it for other groups. Next are what I call our brown cousins. Get into the Mexican experience, get into the Native experience. It's the nearest to you to understand how these power structures by the dominant group have put these things in place to marginalize us, if you will.
Yes.
I want to echo what Christopher said. I think that I feel like it's a Venn diagram, right? It's foundational. It's not a cookie cutter, copy paste, but I think it is foundational. And I feel like it's more like a Venn diagram that, in terms of identity development, as I was rereading that section on cross, it's also about how like coming to know your identity from different perspectives, right? Yourself, society. And I mean, I see it even with my daughter, in navigating like her understanding that she goes to a school that's like 90% Latino. Both of her parents are Latino, and she didn't know that she was Mexican. Like, and so I feel like there's different experiences, and we all navigate them differently, but I think there is something to say about the Black racial identity development theories and how I feel like a lot of marginalized groups can find some commonality and some I'm losing the word, but collective like struggle, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right on right. You hit home with all those points. Thank you, Christopher and America, for that. So this is how you are applying to other groups. And just like what some of you had said, I mean, our experiences are all unique, and you cannot directly generalize this theory to other groups, as obvious it sounds, right? And that could be the critique, right? So these theories that talk about, for example, Black ethnic identity, racial development, do not really include female or women's, development, for example. Their experience is very different versus Black women and Black women versus Black men's experiences, for example, like gendered experiences, for example, right? So, I mean, you are using this as a foundational theory to try to understand like some of the bigger concepts, broader concepts, and macro concepts that come into play, just like what Christopher said, for example, systems of oppression, right? So oppression that are happening to Blacks here in the States, for example, are also operating for other ethnic minority groups, other other minoritized groups, right? So these groups, it really helps us to understand how power operates, for example, and how the system remains in power. Okay, perpetuates its power, for example. This is, for example, the power of theory, power of having like findings from the qualitative research, for example. So these would be not directly generalizable, but then it becomes foundational for us to understand some of the other groups or some of the other data that might be happening, okay, with some of the bigger findings that these foundational research bring us about. Okay. So there is like of course, we'll be critiquing all of these theories by saying, yeah, but these theories neglect to include this population or the sets of data or these recommendations, right? These are the limitations of the studies, and every study has a limitation. But these can be foundational because it helps us to understand certain things so that we can piggyback from the foundings to maybe understand multiracial identities, for example, okay, and or other identities that might not be part of Black identity development, but still, we can learn from what they learned. Black racial identity development theories and research is very pervasive, and it's deeply rooted in American history, as some of you have said, right? And there is a lot of research done in this area. And it talks about we're never colorblind, right? We're never colorblind. So it is very pervasive, it's very prevalent, and we see it, we experience on a daily basis. It's very different from some of the other minoritized identities that can be hidden, right? But still, because of that characteristics, I think that it's important for us to look at Black identity development theories because, it's very foundational, but very different, okay? Questions or reactions? Okay. All right, everybody. Then let's end 5 minutes early. Is that okay? Okay, 5 minutes, and I'll talk to you again next week with some new stuff. See you next week.